So the sort of key thing for this afternoon / morning is to give you some examples and ideas of how you can start developing a social media strategy. The most important thing about a social media strategy is that it has to be unique to your organization, to your collections, to the way that your organization works. So I can't just sort of give you a document that says, here's a social media strategy, off you go. The one thing I will say, actually, would everybody all right to just mute themselves whilst you're not speaking, if that's okay? And if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, so that I can see them. And but yeah, we'll sort of have periods where you can ask questions, so that will be fine. But yeah, as I was saying, the thing about social media strategy is it needs to be unique to your organization, to your collections, to the way that you work. So I can't just give you a document that says, here's a social media strategy, off you go. So the idea of this session is more that I'm going to be giving you the tools to create your social media strategy. So, what we're going to do is Zoom groups. Has anybody done a Zoom group before? So, what is a social media strategy? This is what I got down. Anybody want to shout out what they discussed? Yeah, definitely. I think realistic ideas for resources is a really key point, because there was actually one of the museums that are doing some good social work at the moment, Egham Museum. They sent out a tweet about, they did like a poll to see whether or not museums should be using TikTok. And I think that's quite an interesting point about the sort of resources behind it. You could be on every single platform, but if you've not got the resources to do it properly, you'll just spread yourselves way too thin. Anything else?
I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And something that smaller museums often find difficult, because larger organizations and some small museums, but in general, larger organizations have like a social media person. So one person who manages the social media accounts. Whereas smaller organizations will often find that everybody has, as I'm sure everybody is aware, you have lots of other roles. Social media is just one of them. So if you can have contributions from other members of staff, it really helps to lessen the load. But it also then leads to that sort of like disjointed feel about the voice. Some really good points there. I'm going to move on. The why, these are some of the reasons sort of why a social media strategy. Some of them have already been sort of hinted at. I think a couple of things that are really useful to think about is focusing your mission. And I think social media strategy, if you can make sure that your use of social media ties in with what your organization's missions and goals are. Obviously, it doesn't need to be exact, because often the mission is quite general, not hugely specific. But if you can make sure that your use of social media is sort of helping your organization to achieve its missions in some way, a strategy can really help you achieve that. Strategically flexible, I think, is a good one. There was also, I thought I'd added in, but maybe it hasn't, sort of the idea of what happens during a disaster. And I think, at the moment we can sort of say what's happening with COVID and the lockdown is kind of a disaster, in the sense of you might have like a disaster plan for your collections. If there's a flood or whatever, you know which collections you're getting out and the way that you're doing it. A social media strategy can very much help with that sort of stuff as well. That if there is another lockdown or something similar happens, God forbid, having a strategy can help you deal with that sort of stuff much more effectively. Art Fund actually recently put out a piece of research that they've done based on a survey that they submitted, looking at how museums reacted to the lockdown, particularly when it comes to digital. That found that the museums that have been more strategic with their use of digital, and that includes social media, have fared much better than the organizations that haven't been as strategic with the sort of content that they're creating and the ways that they've still managed to engage audiences. They've found it a lot easier because they had those sorts of frameworks in place, even though they weren't necessarily saying this is what happens if there's a global lockdown. It's still having that strategy there still helps with your use of the platforms. And when things go awry.
Mm.
But I think one of the main reasons that a social media strategy is useful is because it gives you confidence. Sort of confidence to use the platforms, confidence to know what you're doing, confidence to know what the reason that you're using the platforms are. I think quite often there's a habit to say, thinking back to that TikTok example, and it was the same with Snapchat, and it was also the same with Instagram a few years ago as well, that many organizations jumped onto these platforms, and if you were to ask them why, they would say because everybody else is. And that's not a very strategic way to manage how you're using social media. If you can't answer the why by saying because it helps us to achieve our goals, or it will allow us to reach a new audience, or it fits really well with our collections, if the why isn't something along those lines, then maybe you should not be using those platforms. And having a strategy in place can really help you to understand what your organization's strengths and weaknesses are, where your resources are, where your content will perform best, where you have the time to be able to manage these platforms. Having a strategy in place will really put you in a good position for taking opportunities, but making sure that you're using everything strategically. But I think it's important to say that there's no rule saying that you need to have a social media strategy, and if you can't correctly answer, well, not correctly, but can't effectively answer why you need it, who's going to be using it, and what the strategy is for, and if the strategy isn't unique to your institution, your museum, your organization, then there's really no point in having one, because you'll find that it won't get used, and really it's just a sort of waste of time as an exercise. A strategy that is unique to your organization, answers those why, who, what questions, and is used, will be a really useful tool. But if it's just something that's just going to sort of sit in a folder and not be updated and not be looked at, then there's not really much use to it. And the same goes for any sort of strategy that you're creating. It's not just unique to social media. So I think something that you can always start with before you've even thought about creating a social media strategy is to have a review of how you're using social media at the moment, to give you an idea of the platforms that you're using, the content that you're creating. You can look into new platforms that might have come up since you started using social media, decide which platforms work best for your content. You can then sort of use that as almost the foundations for a social media strategy, because it's really difficult to properly strategize if you don't know what position you're already in. So these are just sort of 5 simple steps that you can take before you start the process of drafting your social media strategy. And once you have drafted your social media strategy, this is quite a good way of thinking about how you might then sort of adapt, rethink, restructure your strategy over the course of maybe 6 or 7 months. Because social media changes quite quickly. There's updates to platforms, new opportunities, new issues, new platforms come out. So by doing this process every 6 months, year, it will help you to think about your strategy and think about whether or not you need to review your strategy as well. Is everybody happy with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Cool. So we're going to take a real quick break just for 5 minutes. Right, cool. So 5-minute break over. Next up, we're moving on to laying the foundations. If everybody be all right to mute themselves whilst we're going through this, that would be really helpful. Oh, okay. Put that full screen so that people can see it better. Right, so Zoom groups again. Is everybody want to quickly sort of look at that and make a note of what you need to be doing? Because obviously I won't be able to share my screen whilst you're in your groups. So in your Zoom groups, could you discuss/answer some of the questions from that Google document? But also, it was also a Word document that I shared. I emailed it out yesterday, I think, but you've also got the link to the Google Doc in your joining email. Again, it's going to be in those Zoom groups, so if only one person has it, you can always sort of like read out the questions or whatever. Sort of answer the questions, think about how you might answer them, you know, what it makes you think about your organization, how you plan on using social media. The idea is that as we sort of progress with this session, those questions are going to help you to frame your social media strategy, think about the sort of goals, think about the sort of content you might be creating. But for now, it's very much just sort of to get ideas flowing a little bit and to just sort of discuss amongst yourselves some of the questions and some of your ideas. Everybody happy with that? What we're going to do now for the next sort of 10 or so minutes is I'm going to just sort of talk through some of those questions that you were looking at in the Google Doc. So if there's just one thing that you take away from this entire training session, I really want it to be the idea that a social media strategy needs to be unique to your organization, and it needs to fit where possible with your institution's current goals, mission, and you know what it's trying to achieve. Obviously, that can be within reason. So the Museum of London, for instance, has like one main mission, but then it has a load of sub goals, and social media can help to achieve some of those sub goals, but not all of them, because you know social media isn't a silver bullet. But when you're thinking about your social media strategy, you really want to be thinking about what your organization's mission is, any goals that your organization might have, and how social media can help sort of feed into that. At the very least, if you're thinking about social media strategy, you should have some clear goals as to what you want to achieve with your use of social media. So that could be reaching a new audience, or it could be sharing your collections more widely. Whatever that goal is, you need to think about what the goal is and then how social media and the content you're creating can help to achieve that. The other thing that's worth thinking about is who your target audience is for your use of social media. So if, for instance, your goal is to use social media to reach under 18s, Facebook isn't the place that you're going to do that, because under 18s don't really use Facebook. You know, if you really want to reach those that age bracket, TikTok is the best place to do it. But TikTok is one of the hardest platforms to create content on without seeming awkward and clunky. So you really need to understand how the platforms work. But just as a sort of generalization, I've got some stats at the bottom there of the page down here. So 79% of 18 to 29-year-olds use Facebook. And I think use is a very loose term, because I have a Facebook account, but I don't actually go on Facebook. The only reason I have an account is so that I can use Messenger. I do use Instagram though. So 60% of 18 to 29-year-olds use Instagram, and only 38% of 18 to 29-year-olds use Twitter. So when you're thinking about, you know, who you want to reach, and you really need to be thinking about where those individuals are. And there's a link here to some research by S.M.A.R.T Social, which is looking at the demographics of different social media platforms, predominantly Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So when I send out the slides, definitely check out that link, and we've got some really good information about where different audiences are and how they use the platforms. So how do you want your audience to respond? And I think that's I think this is an important thing to think about depending on what the goal is that you want to achieve. So let's say that your goal is to make your collections more widely accessible. Let's say that's your goal. So when you're thinking about how you want your audience to respond, you want to be thinking about creating content that encourages people to do things like retweets or shares or likes, so that that content can be seen by as many people as possible. If your goal is to, you know, make your collections more widely available. If your goal is, however, to create conversations within your community, you then might want to be thinking about your audience responding more with comments, because comments are much more conversational than just a like, a share, or a retweet. So these are things that you need to be thinking about when you're thinking about how you're creating content and the goals that you're setting through your strategy. And we've already sort of talked a little bit about what your institution's voice is. I think it can be useful to have a voice, but if you've got multiple people creating content on a social media platform, it's very difficult to force people to have a specific voice, particularly if that voice is like, you know, fun slash engaging slash wacky. If the voice is unique, it's difficult to make everybody, you know, follow that line, because not everybody has that ability to communicate online in those sorts of ways. Is everybody happy with that? Does that make sense? Amazing. Also thinking about the types of content that you want to create, and thinking about what types of content you're in the best position to create. So if you have a really pretty building, for instance, maybe a platform like Instagram would be really useful for you, because Instagram is a very visual platform. Organizations like the Old Royal Naval College, for instance, do really well on Instagram because they have, you know, a really nice looking building. The Greenwich as an area is just really nice. Other organizations aren't as fortunate, but they might have what the Old Royal Naval College doesn't have that much of, like collection items. So you might have some really interesting collection items, social history items that you can create some really interesting content around. So maybe for that sort of stuff, Twitter might be a better platform, or Facebook might be a better platform. So you really need to think about where your content is strongest, and trying to utilize the platforms that would best fit that content. Particularly if you're a small team and you don't have a huge amount of time to do social media, you want to be really strategic about where you spend your time and how much time you spend creating content and sharing it. So whilst talking about content creation, just going to really quickly look at the me/us/them method of content creation, which is something that you might think about within your own strategy. So just really quickly, the me content creation method is when you as an organization creates content and shares it out. So if the Museum of London was to tweet something, that is them as me. The us model of content creation is when you encourage members of staff to create content, and then you share that on your institution's platform. So it's not coming directly from you, it's coming from members of staff. And then the them method is when you get your audience to create content and then you share it based on the content that they've created. Again, I'm going to share these so you can look at this in more detail, but these are just some examples. So a couple of examples of me, so the organization creating content. So yeah, just tweets from organizations. Some examples of the us. So Tim Long used to work at the Museum of London. He used to create some really interesting videos around our collection items. And then the Museum of London would retweet that so that their audience could see it, but it's not coming directly from them. This is a really nice one from Madeline Oden. Again, there's a link to it so you can check it out properly. But it's her as a member of staff from her museum. The museum shared it, but it sort of went quite viral because it wasn't necessarily from the museum itself. It was from an individual. It made it a little bit different and interesting. And then some examples of them. So the Royal Institution let this guy, the their Morpholinamics. Not really sure how that's supposed to be pronounced, but that Twitter handle, that guy took over the Royal Institution's social media accounts, and that was really interesting. Again, there's links to that, and that was content created by members of the public, by their audience. And then something the Museum of English Rural Life used to do a lot of is share like sort of farming tweets, rural tweets from their audience. Because they basically said that the farming community gave a lot to them, so they like to sort of give back by highlighting their content. And a lot of it is quite good stuff. And you can, again, see those through the links when I share the slides. A couple more questions. Thinking about Measuring performance of your content is really important, and particularly if you have specific goals like increasing followers or increasing access to your content, to your collections and that sort of stuff, or reaching new audiences. The only way you'll know if you've been successful in doing that is by analyzing the content that you're putting out and looking at how your content is performing and how your social media platforms are developing, because without that analysis, you'll never really know if your strategy is having any effect. So, you could do things like focus groups and surveys of your social media audience, which is something that I did when I was at the Museum of the Order of St. John. That was quite effective. But the simplest way of doing that is to look at the free inbuilt analytics packages on the social media platforms. So Facebook Insights or Twitter Analytics, or vice versa. You can access those and see all of that information and get an idea of how well your content is performing. So something that again I think is important is thinking about how your strategy can act as a backup plan. So at the moment we've had a real taste of what happens when things go wrong, in a way. Lots of members of staff being furloughed, lots of organizations, all of the organizations having to close. Sometimes people are being told to create content or use social media platforms when they've never done that before. For the organizations where that's happening, if they'd had a sort of social media strategy or a social media plan, whatever you want to call it, in place, that transition would have been much easier than it was or has been. And that's something that's happened to tons of museums, but just organizations in general, sort of really realizing that they weren't necessarily prepared for, who could be prepared for this sort of thing, but they weren't necessarily as prepared as they could have been if they'd done a little bit more work beforehand. So that's why I think things like a social media strategy can be really useful, not just for every day, but also for the extraordinary. So that was just a really quick look at some of the questions. We're very much on time, so we're going to take a 5-minute break. So now we're going into the main meat of the training session, thinking about the strategy itself. I'm just going to make everybody a little bit smaller so that I can actually see my screen. Okay, can everybody see that okay? Perfect. So something that you want to be thinking about when you're thinking about the goals that you're going to be setting for yourself with your social media strategy is making sure that they're SMART. So for those who can never remember what the acronym means, including myself, I've written it down and color-coded it. So S, specific, so what do you want to achieve? And being really specific with that goal can be really sort of beneficial in the long run. And particularly when it comes to sort of analysing how well you've performed, the more specific you are, the more detail you'll be able to get out of that analysis and working out whether or not you have actually achieved it. Meaningful. So why is the goal important to your institution? And I think the sort of specific and meaningful are really important. As I've said before, it needs to be unique to your organisation. So that meaningful thing aspect is really important. Action, or I think achievable, is something, another word that's used. So how are you going to achieve it? How are you going to make sure that you can get it done? Are you being realistic? Which brings us on to the R. So how are you going to make sure that it's achievable, that it's something that you can actually do with the platforms that you have available? And I think particularly when it's the first time maybe that you've done a social media strategy, and the first time that maybe you've used social media analytics as part of that, perhaps the sort of more specific and the smaller scale that you can be, the more likely you are to have success. And then that will be more encouraging as you move forward, as opposed to sort of like aiming for the stars and then realizing actually this is really quite difficult and this isn't helpful, and it can become a bit of a waste of time if you're not realistic. And timely as well is quite important. When do you want to achieve it by? So, you know, your overall goal, for instance, or your overall even mission for using social media could be to increase access to our collections. And then you'd set measurable goals within that. So one of your goals could be reach, 100,000 impressions on images of our collections, something like that. And then you'd set a date to achieve that by. So we want to achieve this by next year. So you'd also look at, before you set that goal, you'd also, when we're talking about that reviewing part of a social media strategy at the very beginning, and before you set that goal, you want to make sure that it is something that's realistic. So if at the moment you're only getting 1,000 like 100 impressions on each 10 pictures or something, if you then say we want 500,000 impressions by the end of the month, that isn't realistic. So either you want to make it the objective realistic, so say 1,000 impressions at the end of the month, or you increase the time, so you say 100,000 impressions by the end of the year. And then if you achieve that before the end of the year, you could look at it, review it, and then set yourself a new goal. Everybody happy with that? So as I was saying, other ideas, you could base it around institutional goals, the content that you're going to use to achieve those goals, and the audience that you're going to be trying to attract with the content that you're creating. So when you're thinking about institutional goals, you want to think about what your institution aims to achieve through social media, and how does social media fit with your wider organization's institutional goals, which I mentioned quite a few times, but it is important. You also want to be thinking about the types of content that you're creating. So, what are your unique collections? What are your stories? What members of staff do you have? And what sort of talents? And, everybody has something, and it might well be something that you can utilize for social media. What platforms you'll use, and then how you'll put this content online. So if you have lots of like talks, you might be thinking about live streams on social media platforms. If you have lots of like images that you'd like to digitize, you might think of Flickr as a good platform to do it. So again, you want to be thinking about the content that you have and the platforms that fit best for that content. And then the audience as well. So, who are you aiming your content at? Thinking about where your audience is based, both the audience that you're trying to attract, perhaps, but also the audience that you currently have. As we were sort of saying earlier during the break, if your audience is predominantly international and you're trying to get people, and your sort of one of your social media goals is to get people to come to your events with an entirely or predominantly international audience, you're going to really struggle to do that. So you might want to think about how you can, keep trying to encourage people to come to your events, but also keep your current audience interested at the same time. And a lot of that is about being creative with how you're sort of doing your content. And thinking about where your audience is, so the platforms that they're predominantly using, and thinking about the content that works best for those audiences. And then again, sort of with everything, with the content, with your goals, with the audiences that you're trying to reach, you really need to be thinking about how you're planning on evaluating your performance. And again, social media analytics is probably the easiest and most obvious way to do that. So then, that's how you'd sort of set out as a social media strategy. If you wanted to, you can do goal 1. The content that you're using, the audience that you're trying to attract. And I think before we actually go on to looking at the creation of a social media strategy, it's important to think about reviewing your strategy and how often you're going to review it. So we're going to look at that US National Archives strategy in a minute. And I think theirs was 3 years, 2017 to 2020. So that's a 3-year long strategy, but I'm sure they would have had periods within that where they reviewed it and looked at how they're performing, how they're going towards their goals, whether they can change any of those goals. I think for a strategy to be useful, I would want to review it at least once a year. Ideally, if you had the time, maybe once every 3 to 6 months to review your strategy, and just so that it's, you know, up to date and it's relevant. Social media platforms change so quick, so often. And then there's also situations like the situation we're in at the moment with lockdown, where your strategy that you had before might not be quite fit for purpose. So you want to think about how you can adapt it for the situation. You know, lockdown is a good example of that, but there's loads of other situations that could come up that could mean that you need to sort of readapt and rethink about how you're using social media. Okay, how to model it. By the way, I get all of my images from a website called Pixabay. It's free, and they're all out of copyright, and you can use them usually for non-commercial purposes. And there's also one called Uplar, UPLAR, where you can get lots of good images. Uplar is a bit more artsy, whereas Pixabay is a bit more generic. So this is the model that, when we get to it, I've given you a sort of like draft model for a social media. Sorry, I just saw somebody's cat come into frame. I've given you a sort of like basic draft for how you could set a social media strategy. And this is the kind of model that we'll be looking at. So sort of thinking about institutional missions, institutional goals, thinking about your social media goal. So what you want to achieve through social media and how that links to your wider organization's goals. And then the tactics that you're going to be taking to achieve that through social media platforms. And then you want to be thinking about the content that you're creating, that sort of, those aspects of your social media strategy then are sort of, you know, shown within the content that you're creating. So I'm going to quickly look at the US National Archives here. So this is US National Archives social media strategy. It's broken up into different goals. So this is the sort of that web platform that I was talking about. This is really detailed, and I'm not saying that this is what you'd, you know, have to do. There's a huge amount of detail here. So if we just look at one of the goals, goal 1, tell great stories. And then here they've got the different sort of sub goals that they want to do to help achieve that goal. So like support staff, storytelling, the different actions that they have, how they're going to go about achieving it. So as you can see, there's a huge amount of detail here. I would probably say that this is a little bit too much detail, but it very much depends on how your organization works and how you work as well. Again, I think it's way too much detail. I'm not saying that that's what you need to do, but it's a good thing to look at, to take some inspiration, to think about how you could you know, model your own social media strategy. It's worth mentioning the US National Archives obviously is a huge organization, so that's why they've got a very detailed strategy. But so we're going to be going back to those questions that you're all talking about in your Zoom groups. I think what we'll do instead is let's just have some quiet reflection time where you can, as an individual as opposed to Zoom groups, look through those questions, and then also use the draft social media strategy document that I shared yesterday to think about a social media strategy. So we're going to just focus on one goal. So we're going to think about one goal that you want to achieve using social media strategy. You know, the platforms that you might use to achieve it, the content that you might be creating, all of that sort of stuff, and use that draft strategy as to sort of like structure your thinking. But hopefully it sort of gave you a bit of a start and an opportunity to think a little bit about the sorts of goals you might be setting. And then, as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, that we're also offering that extra half an hour. So once you've had a bit of time to think more about your goals, you know, what you want to do with social media, we can, if you fancy, have a more in-depth chat to talk specifically about, you know, your organization, and we can have a look through that strategy together. If that's something that you fancy doing, we can do that. Cool. So here are some examples of social media strategies. Some of them are a bit dated, just because museums don't really tend to put their social media strategies online anymore. A lot of these were put online when not many museums were using social media strategies. So the ones that did have strategies, put them online so that everybody could sort of see them and work off of it. But some of them still work as ideas of how you could sort of set it out, not necessarily ideas of what you want to achieve, because again, you know, unique to your organization. But it could be helpful to sort of give you ideas of how you want to sort of set out and present your strategy. I think sometimes that can be quite useful. And as I've said a million times before, I might just change this to social media strategy. It has to be unique to your institution, and just have that as the title for the session. But yeah, unique to your institution, unique to your collections, unique to your mission. There's no point in copying or pasting another organization's social media strategy. Despite it being tempting, it's not going to be useful. It's just going to be a waste of time. So, you know, if you want it to be a useful, helpful document, then putting in the work to make it so is really necessary. Okay, so we're just going to end for the last sort of 5 or so minutes, just looking a little bit at social media in action. This is a really there's a really useful example here, which I'm going to talk about. If everybody's just happy to mute themselves again, so that we can just to save the audio for when I'm editing, that would be great. So, social media in action now. The Museum of English Rural Life has been done to death, but for good reason, because it's a really good organisation on social media. Not only when Adam Kazari was there, however many years ago that was now, maybe like last year or 2 years ago, I lose track. He did some really great work in sort of developing their strategy and building towards the sort of Museum of English Rural Life as it's known today. But then Joe Vaughan, their current social media manager, has sort of followed in his footsteps and really sort of taken that on. And I think a lot of that sort of continued success is down to a very clear and a very well thought out social media strategy. So this is actually based off of a talk that Adam did at the Museums and Heritage Show last year or the year before. And he was basically talking about how nothing that they did, like the Absolute Unit and the Chicken in Trousers, all of their sort of well-known social media content, none of it was a mistake. They sort of had a strategy in place and they were building towards that sort of content. Obviously, you can't guarantee that a piece of content is going to go viral, but if you're sort of really good with your strategy, really good with your analytics, you can kind of gather an idea of what's going to be popular and what isn't. And then the stuff that is more popular is more likely to go viral, particularly on platforms like Twitter, where it's quite easy to sort of share and reshare content. So this is just sort of some snippets from a blog that he wrote about his sort of time at the Museum of English Rural Life and the strategy behind what they were doing. Again, you can click this and there's a link to it, to the blog, and it's really worth reading it when you're thinking about your own strategy and how you're going to use social media. Again, I'm not saying that you need to emulate the Museum of English Rural Life. I think it's a good case study to look at, to think about how they use social media strategically and the sort of benefits that they've had based off of that strategy. But this, I think, is a really nice sort of visualization of a social media strategy in a way. So content is just the tip of the iceberg. Obviously, everybody sees the Absolute Unit, that sort of tweet that went impressively viral. Everybody sees that, but behind it, there's so much work that has gone on behind the scenes to get them to the position to make that sort of content. And you have to have like the creativity to think of it, the social media immersion. So the idea that the whole organization is immersed in the creation of social media content. People would sort of approach Adam from the Museum of English Rural Life and say, I've been working in the collections and I've seen this, it could be quite funny. I think there was last year, a tweet that they did about a chicken wearing trousers. I don't know if people saw that, but if you didn't, just type chicken in trousers, Museum of English Rural Life, and I'm sure it will come up. And that all came about because a member of staff was looking through a collection item and saw a load of doodles that they thought, oh, this would be good for social media. And then, Adam rolled with that and took it to the next level with his sort of like creativity and his knowledge of how social media platforms work. I think there's also, for that sort of stuff to be successful, there has to be a great deal of trust in the individual using social media. And trust is something that you can build up first with, good examples of your work. So if you've got a sort of concise and clear social media strategy, you'll have an idea of what success is, because you'll have your goals and you'll be analyzing your content, looking at how you're achieving those goals, and you'll be able to then take examples of good practice, good work to managers, and you can build that trust up. But I think having a social media strategy in the first place is quite a good way of showing that you're committed to using these social media platforms, and you know what you're doing and you know why you're doing it. And I think that can really help to build up that level of trust as well. And then also underneath that, which is a whole other discussion, but something that he says was really important was collections management. So knowing what collections they have, where those collections are, having that information, so that he, as somebody who's creating social media content, can go through the different assets. So, the collection items, the assets that the museum has, and then create social media content based on the stuff that the museum has. So if you already have a good collections management system, or if you have people who really know the collections well, they can be a really great source of content, because they'll know what's interesting, what's a bit unique, what's a bit quirky, and often that's the sort of stuff that does really well on social media. So the two musts of any social media strategy, other than being unique to your institution, is content and communication. So you could have the best strategy in the world, but if you're not thinking about the content that you're putting out, and you're not thinking about how you're going to communicate it, it's going to be quite difficult to achieve those goals. So every goal is going to have some sort of content propping it up, because that's what the public is seeing. Obviously, the public doesn't know that when they see all of these images of your collection items, that your goal is to increase access to your collections. They just see the content. So if the content isn't interesting, or if they're not engaging with it, you're not going to achieve that goal. And then you can have the best content in the world, but if you're not communicating it very well, it's going to be a stumbling block, because not as many people are going to see it, not as many people are going to enjoy it. So when you're thinking about your strategy, you want to be thinking about the content that you have and the way that you're going to be communicating it.